Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out or staying at home this evening. It's really great to see you. One of the few golden linings of all this Zoom business is the number of people who can come to talks like this from places other than just Edinburgh, where we always had them in the flesh. But here you are from all sorts of different parts of the world, and that's absolutely great. We are doing these Tuesday talks every Tuesday, and we have lots of other things like mediumship demonstrations. And I can't resist telling you that I'm beginning a 10-week Sunday afternoon course on poetry and spirituality starting next Sunday. And it's a limited numbers course. And if there are one or two places left, I think 2 places left, if anybody's interested in poetry and spirituality and have got some Sunday afternoons free, you can sign up on our website or in your usual way. But tonight it's about mysticism, spirituality and everyday life. 3 steps, I suppose. Mysticism is about as high as you can get, and I suppose everyday life is about as low as you can get. I want to start by telling you a story about something that happened to me when I was at school. I was educated by Benedictine monks and 1 or 2 lay masters at a Benedictine abbey in England. That's where I did my secondary education, and interesting it was. And I remember various things about it, some of them better, some of them worse, but no child abuse, I may say. But I do remember one day going back into the Abbey Church. We had to go to the Abbey Church really rather a lot. I mean, you know, Catholic boys, sort of mass at 7 in the morning before breakfast. Of course, it had to be before breakfast because you couldn't go to communion if you'd eaten before, and it was all in Latin. It was all rather good in some ways. But the poor old monks, perhaps I shouldn't put it that way, they were technically going into the church, not only for mass in the morning, but for the 8 hours, the divine office, the hours, the horai, 8 times a day. They'd squashed it up. So they did Matins, Lauds and Prime together, and they did Terce, Sext and None together, and then they separately did Vespers and Compline. But that meant 4 visits to the church plus mass, so make it 5, and sometimes there were extra things, so it could easily be 6. Let's say an average of 5.5 times a day. And on one occasion, I went into the church for some reason, and I looked up towards the high altar where they had the choir, you know, where the monks would sit, which was empty because it wasn't a time for divine office. But there was a monk sitting there with his hood over his head. I looked at him, and he sat there. So I turned to somebody else who was in the body of the kirk passing by, and I said, "Who's that? And what's he doing?" Thinking, what's he doing in here again? You know, doesn't he get enough of it? And I was 15 or something. And the person who answered me said, "Oh, that's Father Whatnot. He comes in to meditate." And I had a non-paranormal, perfectly ordinary, but very clear vision. And the vision that I had was that Father Whatnot had come in to do the real thing. That being a monk with vows of chastity, obedience, and the other one, poverty, and going into church 5.5 times a day, and being utterly devoted to prayer, and not having anything, and giving your life to God, that wasn't the real thing. The real thing was what he was doing there alone. And that has left me with a question, and a few answers, I hope, about what it is to be a mystic. Because the aspiration of contemplation, as is often called in the Catholic Church, or meditation, the intention was a kind of connection with God, which in some way, no number of rituals, no number of funny clothes and bells and smells was going to give him. And this is me now, many years later, thinking 60 years later, thinking, well, what is that mysticism still? And I've thought of some answers at least. We mustn't be mixed up about what mysticism is. The word mystic is used very vaguely in a perfectly normal way, this flexibility of the English language in which anything can mean anything, to the great surprise of the French, who always insist that things have to mean exactly what they mean and nothing more. So they have fewer puns and less poetry. But I mean, there was a kind of mysticism, people say, in ancient Egypt, and in Babylon, and in ancient Greece, and in Rome. And if you look at what they mean when they say there was mysticism, there wasn't. There were the mysteries, the Orphic mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Bacchic mysteries. If you go to Pompeii, there's a place in Pompeii called the Villa of the Mysteries. That's the correct word. And the mysteries were simply things which were private, things which the public weren't allowed to go and join in on. And the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii has those beautiful frescoes, which all of you have seen. And there are a series of, it's an initiation rite, which involves various rather dubious activities, I have to say. But anyway, it's an initiation rite after which you are drinking, I don't know, the blood of Bacchus or the wine of God or whatever it is, and then you're an initiate. I mean, it's a bit like a souped up and sexier version of joining the Masons. That's a mystery. That's not being a mystic. Our mysticism begins perhaps with the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, the last pagan philosopher at the end of the period of the Roman Empire before Constantine in 313 or whatever turned the Roman Empire Christian. The last one was rather a mystical philosopher. You can find some of the stuff there. And then it disappears into the Dark Ages, I think, showing itself only occasionally what this mysticism is. And everybody has a vague idea about it, but it's not clear to me that many people have a clear idea. And I'm going to turn first then to the English 14th century. And it's rather extraordinary that in the period of the Black Death and some of the worst parts of English history there was, and simultaneously in Germany and Spain and Italy, there were mystics, people who didn't just devote their lives to God. Many of them were monks, many of them were priests, some of them were nuns. But they didn't just devote their lives to God. They went to another level and another level beyond that. And we only know about them because they wrote some of it down. And my question really, thinking about these extremist people, I mean, they're a kind of Christian equivalent of jihadists, but luckily their jihad, you know, in Islam, there are two versions of jihad. One has a sword and the other doesn't, because it's meant to be an internal struggle against Satan or against yourself. Well, these are sort of spiritual jihadists in that they are really extreme, and reading them takes us to a place which I think should color our idea of what we're doing in the Arthur Conan Doyle Center and in other such places where we are looking at things spiritual, things paranormal, and things which are perhaps now replacing some aspects of religion. The word mystic simply means hidden. It's simply a Greek word which means hidden, which is why mystery is hidden. You'll remember that there are some murderers in Shakespeare who don't want to tell how they're going to commit a murder because it's their mystery. It doesn't mean they're trying to conceal the murder from the police. They're quoting all the guilds, you know, the fleshers and the shoemakers and all these people and the silk dyers. They all had their mystery, and that's what it was called. Their secret way of making what they made, so that, you know, it was a sort of closed shop. Our interest, the interest of everybody here tonight, I think, is presumably spiritual, paranormal, and so on. And here we are it seems to me, in the middle of a circle of things which bump up against us. Philosophy clearly bumps up against us. It has things to say critical of anything spiritual, but we are now moving towards a possible panpsychism, becoming a respectable philosophy, and which we've heard about in this series, where perhaps consciousness, instead of merely being a byproduct of matter, is in fact primordial and maybe the condition by which matter exists at all. We have physics, which of course classically was the center of science, and thus of course against spirituality. But since quantum mechanics, which is now, of course, as you know, more than 100 years old, we realize, even the physicists realize, that there's something funny going on at the deepest level of matter, which looks more like something to do with an energy, which looks quite like something possibly spiritual. And then psychologists are very keen to tell you why you're hearing voices. But recently, psychological researchers have begun to see that some people hear voices because they're a bit nuts and they need treatment and psychotherapy, and I feel sorry for them. But other people hear voices for reasons which are not to do with their being nuts. So whose voices are they hearing? So we're bumping up against these various disciplines. And also more recently, evolutionary biology, of course, has been very keen to explain to us that we are as we are because of our DNA, perfectly true, and that bits of the brain do different things at different times. That, of course, has slightly backfired on the materialists, because what we're discovering is that near-death experiences, for example, and spiritually extreme experiences activate the same part of the brain, even when they produce veridical material. That's stuff that can be proved, that people have seen or known, which they couldn't possibly have seen or known. So it's coming through the brain, but it's not of the brain. So we bump up against all these things. And the reason why we're a little bit squeezed in the middle is that we're the discipline, we who are interested in spirituality and the paranormal and all that, we are the discipline that takes subjectivity and consciousness on directly. We're the only people who go straight for that as valid experience. And we are, of course, very strongly backed up by the simple, widely accepted philosophical fact, which is that experience depends on consciousness. Your table has no experience because it has no consciousness. In another lecture, I might say it does have a sort of consciousness, but not the sort of consciousness I'm talking about now. You have consciousness, and therefore you have experience. But if you have experience, then you are the only possible subjective thing. You are, in a way, creating the universe. Where consciousness is in question, if you are basing your discipline, as we are, on our consciousness, our experience, then that gives us a kind of extra. Chemistry isn't interested in the consciousness of the chemist, and they're certainly not interested in the possible consciousness of the molecules which they're dealing with, though I think there might be something to be said for that at a different time. So we have consciousness and experience at the center, and that's what mystics have. It's what they're not doing when they're singing the psalms in choir. It's what they're not doing when they're saying mass. It's what they're not doing when they're saying the rosary. It's what they're not doing when they're bowing and facing Mecca. It's that other thing, which is their private, not public experience. And in the end, consciousness and private experience, and this is our real trump card, are the only thing of which we can be certain. You know many things, but the only thing you know for certain is that you know them. Descartes was right. Cogito ergo sum doesn't translate as I think, therefore I am. It translates, I am conscious. The Latin wouldn't be able to do it any other way. I am conscious, therefore I am. If you're not conscious, you're certainly not. Try hitting yourself very hard on the head with a hammer and you will discover that you're not there anymore. Well, religion has been objective on the whole. That's its strength. The religions were very successful. They took over all sorts of areas of life. And as they've retreated from those areas of life, they've been pushed more and more towards the subjective, that heart, which I'm sure very many religious people have somehow managed to ignore in perfectly good religious lives. That thing that there was only one monk sitting in the choir meditating by himself, whereas there were sort of 50 when it came to Matins, Lauds, and Prime. And against the objective, we have the subjective. For example, Plotinus, the only proper mystic philosopher before the Christian mystics, Plotinus speaks of his journey as a flight from the alone to the alone. Well, that's one of those things you think, well, what does that mean? But I think if you contrast it with the flight of the many to the many, or the flight of the lost to the found, those are different ideas. The flight of the alone to the alone sets the tone for mysticism. And the mystics are the people who aimed to explore the deep self. The idea of a deep self, which may be a bit of a myth in itself. I mean, a post-structuralist would say there's something rather mythological about the idea of my deep self. And actually, personally, as a kind of semi-Buddhist, I would say there's a bit of a question over the notion of the self. And we're going to have to come on to that. But the mystic explores his deep self in the assumption that by going deeply, deeply, deeply within, that flight to the alone, from the alone, will be to the alone that is God, and there'll be an interchange between the one that is up there and the one that is me. Angelus Silesius, one of the mystics I will be mentioning again later on, a slightly later German mystic from the 16th century, talks of the abyss of my spirit always invokes with cries the abyss of God. And which may be the deeper? And so mystics very often got into trouble during the Christian centuries because they tended to make claims that, they were with God, that they were one with God, that God was one with them, that they were God. And there are some disgusting stories which come out of narratives about the 11th and 12th century more fanatical new style of Islam, which developed when the mullahs and the imams rather took over Islam, which is why Islamic science tends to be mostly from the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries and not beyond, and why Sufic mysticism has always been regarded as rather suspicious in Islam since then. But there are stories of, rather wild, mystic Muslims proclaiming that they are one, I am one with God and all this, whereupon they immediately get killed because that doesn't go with the objective thing that is their religion. The difference between, I suppose, religion and science and philosophy on the one side and the mystic is that religion, science, and philosophy think they know. Here comes the interesting part, the first interesting part, I hope. Mysticism knows it doesn't know. So I'm going to look for a moment at the Cloud of Unknowing, which is an anonymous text, of which I have a cheap edition here because I couldn't find a better one, written in English, slightly early English, of course it's halfway between Middle English and Modern English, by an anonymous chap in 1400. It's been described, the Cloud of Unknowing, as Christianity with a Zen outlook. And it's interesting that from this, just before 1400 and just after, we suddenly discover lots of other people, some of whom you've certainly heard of, like Julian of Norwich, or Jacob Boehme, or Walter Hilton, or Meister Eckhart in Germany, in Holland, and in Britain, and of course people like St. John of the Cross in Spain, and St. Teresa in Spain, and the two St. Catherines in Italy, all of whom suddenly start producing these texts describing their extreme mystic experience. And I think that's a test for us, because I think that hovering at the back of my mind, and I'm sure at yours, there must be the feeling beyond, is there anything in this spiritual stuff? Comes the next feeling, well, I've got this evidence and I've had that experience, and but what's the real thing? How far could we go down this road? I mean, should I put on orange robes and go and live in the monastery at Samiling in Dumfriesshire, where I can just be a Buddhist and sort of be completely silent? Shall I go to Holy Island off Arran, where when I was there last summer, I looked at some little sort of hobbit holes and I said, what's that? And the bloke said, that's where there are nuns on lifetime retreats. Complete silence and solitude. Is that what we're supposed to do? In other words, there's always someone who has overbid you, who's gone a bit further, and should we be doing a bit more in those directions? So I thought these mystics, they go the full length. And the subtitle of the Cloud of Unknowing is the book in which one is oned with God. The book in which one is oned, I mean, sort of united, I suppose, and he has a less Latinate English because it's the late Middle Ages, so he says, in which one is oned, the soul is going to be oned with God. And I'll just give you a little bit of the Cloud of Unknowing and see if you can follow it. It's quite good, but he's saying something absolutely radical. Silence is not God. Oh, you think, oh, bloody hell, I thought when I was silent, I was closer to God. But no. They never let you away with these hopeful ideas. Silence, he says, is not God. Nor speaking is not God. Fasting is not God. Nor eating is not God. I mean, what have we got left? Loneliness is not God. Nor company is not God, nor yet any of all the other two such contraries. Any pair you can think of, black and white, male and female, none of them are of God. He is hid between them, and may not be found by any work of thy soul, but all only by love of thine heart. And by soul there, he quite clearly means mind, as well as what you might call soul. I don't personally think we have souls, but it's pretty clear we have something which we may as well call a mind. I don't mean we don't have something which might carry on after death, but for me, it would just be consciousness. That's the cruel, and you can use soul as a metaphor if you like. But anyway, his idea is that nothing you do with your mind, nothing you do with what he calls your soul, can do anything. That's not God. You have to approach God only with your heart. So we're wasting our time this evening. You're all wasting your time, because what you're trying to do is understand my thinking about the fact that we shouldn't be thinking. You should just be out there, whatever it means, approaching God with your heart only. This is quite radical stuff. I mean, no wonder they got into trouble with the church, these guys. Stop explaining things to me. Just go silent. But the silence isn't good enough. Well, just talk. Well, the talk isn't good enough. Well, what do we got? Well, your heart. What does that mean? Well, you've got to love. How do I love God without knowing anything? The book is called The Cloud of Unknowing. And I'll tell you how its mechanics work. Its mechanics work like this, that you learn to speak and you go to school and you learn the truths, in this case, of the Christian religion as they would see it, And having learnt them, you go further into it and you read more. And I don't know, you learn Greek and Hebrew or whatever, you sort of move on and you learn and you organize your mind and you organize your day and you organize your life and you become a priest and you become a monk and you become a hermit and you become silent and all this kind of thing. And at that point, you bump up against not the thing you are seeking, which is God, but in the cloud of unknowing, you bump up against a cloud. God, of course, is light, and you have the light of your knowledge. But between those two lights, like the middle of a hamburger, there is a cloud of unknowing, and you cannot reach God without going through the cloud of unknowing. Now, tell me how you're going to do that. I'm just going to unknow for a bit. Try unknowing. Not easy. Try stop thinking for a start. Not easy. Although remember, when we get onto Buddhism, we'll find that the Zen monks have a no-mind meditation and wish to get to exactly that. In fact, Zen mysticism is very, very similar to this Christian mysticism. It's most interesting, and there was no contact between them at the time. So this notion of a sort of divine ignorance that you have to have, that's very striking. The most goodly knowing of God is that which is known by unknowing. The process is going up to unknowing and never reaching God. But even though you don't know, you know that this is the way in which you have to reach God. This is difficult stuff. And I don't just mean difficult to understand. I wouldn't mean difficult to perform. And I must rather brutally say that I absolutely do not believe that the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing was at that level all the time. I am sure from time to time he had to decide, what they were going to have for lunch in the monastery or whether he needed a clean habit. That must be the case. So we mustn't be too intimidated by it. When you switch to St. John of the Cross, we go even further, because he wrote The Dark Night of the Soul, La Noche Oscura del Alma, which is the most incredible thing. Again, of course, it's Christian. And 61, 62. Yeah, there we are. Remember that we've just been told that we mustn't know and think. We're in the cloud of unknowing. We're now going to go further with St. John of the Cross. It is fitting that in order that the will may be able to attain to divine affection and most lofty delight, and to feel it and experience it through the union of love, since it is not in the way of nature perceptible to the will, it be first purged. So whatever you're thinking, whatever you're doing, all this approach, it's got to be purged, okay? Purged and annihilated in all its affections and feelings, and left in a condition of aridity and constraint. So Cloud of Unknowing says, stop thinking, don't know. And now St. John of the Cross says, it's not your heart. Stop feeling. You must be purged of all your affections before you can see what God is or become one with God. And it's really rather extraordinary. So that being exhausted, withered, and thoroughly tried in the fire of this dark contemplation, and having driven away every kind of evil spirit, you will be able to get to God. And he then comes up with a very famous metaphor. You'll be pleased to know he starts this chapter where he's producing his metaphor to explain things for the greater clearness of all those who read this. In other words, if you don't quite know what it would mean to be completely sort of, annihilated in terms of your feelings, it's something like the same way as fire acts upon a log of wood in order to transform it into itself. For material fire, acting upon wood, first of all, begins to dry it. That's the aridity, you see, driving out its moisture and causing it to shed the water which it contains within itself. That's your thoughts and feelings. Then it begins to make it black, dark, and unsightly, and even to give forth a bad odor, and so on. And as it dries little by little, it brings out and drives away, and so on. And finally, the log begins to kindle. Externally, it gives out heat, and at last, it transforms it into itself. The fire transforms the log into itself and becomes as beautiful as fire. Now, this is a fabulous piece of poetry. Those of you who wish to take my poetry course may hear a bit more about being transformed into fire by fire. God is the fire. I burn myself up so that I am absolutely nothing, so that I become God. Very typical piece of mystic discourse. But look at what we've now lost. We've lost the opportunity to think, and we've lost the opportunity to feel. I mean, you might feel that I'm perhaps getting further away from everyday life rather than closer to. The Sufi mystic Rumi produces another metaphor extremely familiar to you. He, I think, is the first one who says, I am a drop in the ocean. That's a little bit more comfortable, isn't it? It's not sort of burning away and forgetting and so on. It's just realizing that we're not really fully separate from anything else. We're part of something else, and the great something else must be God, and I'm that. And he even says, he says that everything in the universe is within you. So yeah, that's a bit better. I don't have to sort of clear it all out. Perhaps I can just accept the entire universe. You feel a bit better when you're reading Rumi. He's a very good and rather humane poet for a Muslim mystic of the 13th century. He said, this is rather lovely. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find within yourself all the barriers that you've built against it. In other words, the problem is inside you, and you remove the barriers, and then love will come, and love is God, of course. It's like drinking wine, as in Omar Khayyam, that kind of imagery. So he's a drop in the ocean, and he's part of the great divine drink, and we're all liable to be merged in that way. And finally, amongst this lot of mystics, something you're perhaps more familiar with, you may remember that at the beginning of the Paradiso, I mean, it's fabulous. I really love it. Dante says to you, look, he's taken by Virgil through hell and purgatory, and he's going to be taken by Beatrice, of course, this wonderful virgin creature, up to the mystic rose and up to meet God. So it's the same trajectory. And he said, I am not right. I'm not going to be able to get all the way up there because I don't have the right wings. I just don't have the wings to get up to God. And it's rather charming. And you may also remember that when Beatrice gets him to the edge of the mystic rose, he never says what it is, but obviously it's God somewhere hidden, as usual, behind there, mystic hidden God. When he gets to the edge of the mystic rose, Beatrice says, come on. And Dante says, I can't go any further. And of course, the answer there is he probably can't, but particularly if he's writing a poem for lumps like you and me, he's not going to be able to write in Italian, which will make any sense to us if he actually perceives the center of the mystic rose. So I can't go there. Sorry. Well, I've talked a little bit about Buddhism because obviously there is Eastern and Western going on here. And just as Western mystics correct Christianity, so Buddhism corrects Hinduism or corrects some sort of religiosity in Buddhism. Actually, religion isn't really any good. I mean, another of the things that I think it's St. John of the Cross says is that saints and angels are all very well, but they're not the way to God. They're an impediment. Okay, so praying isn't the way to God. Actually, it's not a bad thing, really, but it's an impediment. So, boy, have we lost a lot of stuff. And we're going to lose even more with the Buddhists. Cast away, says the Buddha, all arbitrary notions of the existence of a personal self, of other people, or of a universal self. Otherwise, the mind still grasps after these conceptions. And Buddha is forever telling us not to have conceptions, not to make differences, because there's only one of us. The separateness is an illusion. We should also discard all notions of non-existence. Perhaps some of you will know that I'm clearly creeping up on the most difficult text in all mysticism, which is the Buddha's Diamond Sutra, which only has the one advantage, which is that it's actually rather short compared with many other Buddhist texts. There is, says the Buddha, no Buddha and no teachings. I thought I wanted to be a Buddhist. Sorry, there's no, the monk who says to his, there's always some sort of pathetic apprentice monk who sort of says to the boss monk, what should I do about this? And the boss monk sort of slaps him down with some terrible retort. I'm going on a journey, master. What should I do? Ah, says the master, go on your journey. And when you meet the Buddha, kill him. You must have heard that. Kill the Buddha. There is no Buddha. There is no teachings. And this is, so that's, I'm taking you further and further up, or further and further out, or further and further towards the great nothing. Even as I speak, says the Buddha, I must take back my words as soon as they're uttered. Reminding us, if you're at all interested in modern philosophy, French philosophy, Derrida writes in an incomprehensible manner, because the minute he writes in a comprehensible manner, he's not accurate, he's not right, he's not being fair to language and understanding. which can always make meaning slip. And so there's a lot of self-contradiction in Derrida and some actually incomprehensible stuff. Very, very Buddhist, if you like. A true disciple, says the Buddha, cannot enter the stream of enlightenment because they wouldn't think of themselves as a separate person. So if you say to me, I'm a true student, or even better, I'm a bodhisattva, I'm an arhat, I'm a monk, I've seen a certain amount of enlightenment, the minute you say it to me, or think it, or conceive of it, it's a conception, and therefore it's wrong, because all conceptions are wrong, because they make you think of yourself as something else. I'm English, I'm French, I'm German. You're thinking of yourself. So there's no identity, because all things merge completely into one another. We tend to think that I'm here and the lamp is over there. But you know that there are plenty of molecules between you and the lamp. And the same applies to time as well as to space. The 10,000 things, the Buddha says, are names, preconceived notions, conceptions, ideas. And that's what's wrong. I admit there's no God to reach in Buddha. There's a nirvana. But it would be a nirvana of no mind. Well, I don't know whether this would be the moment to move to everyday life. You might get a bit more of the Dharma Sutra in a minute, but perhaps you'd like to get to everyday life as we hit the hour. I've gone as far as I can. The Buddha, as you well know, believed in compassion as well. So, of course, did Jesus Christ and all his followers. Another very simple parallel. The happiness of all creatures, or in Buddhist terms, the liberation from suffering of all creatures. And the clue to that, because it seems like a contradiction for all that negative theology which I've been preaching from the mystics. The clue is to become one, you know all this, to become one with your actions and non-actions in order to overcome the illusion. And you know what you're supposed to do is when you're doing the washing up, you're supposed to be mindful. So you're supposed to think, I am doing the washing up, and you don't let other things come in. But that's not, that may be a useful bit of meditation. It may help you, and you may get better washing up, and you may become happier. But that's not really the deep point. The deep point is that you are not separate from the washing up. Becoming one with it is recognizing your non-separateness from it. The conception is only an idea of yours. I'm doing the washing up. I'm a human being. I'm a man, and I'm doing the washing up. You know how all the conceptions work. And the idea is to reduce these conceptions by becoming one with the things you do, not merely in order to do them better. That's not the point. All this is, of course, best caught in Zen. And I've got a bit of Zen here. It's a very good Zen book. I'm not showing off when I tell you, if you find it what I read a bit odd, I bought this book when I was living and working in France, which I did for many years, and I'm afraid it's in French. And it's something quite sophisticated about that, isn't there? You know, reading Zen stuff in French, but actually I'd much rather read it in English because I'm not sure that French catches it in quite the same way. We know that we're supposed to live in the present. Another of those paradoxes, that everything is here and now. Your consciousness must be here, and it always must be now. Well, that's quite a good start. The cloud of unknowing makes the same point. How are we going to deal with that? Well, here's a bit of Zen in order to make that work. In Zen, people say that all the teachings of Buddhism and of Zen are skillful means. They're like, you'll recognize this, they're like a finger pointing at the moon. People say that if you look in the direction indicated by the end of the finger, you will see the moon. The objective of the teaching is to see the moon. However, the loon, I tell you it's French, the moon and the finger are the same thing. That's the bit where we tend to stop and take a bit of a breath, isn't it? The moon and the finger are the same thing. If someone teaches you that the moon and the finger are separated, it's not right. To speak more simply, as long as you don't understand the, what are they called? The skillful means exist in themselves. But as soon as you understand Zen, you understand that the skillful means are also the skillful means are also the result. That is to say, as I say, what you need to do is to point at the moon. It's that thing that I'm doing, which is the Zen moment. because obviously that will lead you to realize that what you're ultimately being told is there's no difference between the moon and the finger. But it's at that moment when I tell you, or that moment where you think it, that happens. I subscribe to a website. No, I get emails every week from a spiritual entity called Veronica, who lives in California, unsurprisingly. Actually, it's a woman who's a deep trance medium who transmits Veronica's messages. And Veronica is a group of people on the other side. And every email ends with the thing which is now extremely, extremely common, the saying that in spiritual matters, you're always at the beginning. You're never at the end. So in a way, I've now gone round in a bit of a circle, because we've been seeing these mystics going towards the end, getting to the mystic rose, meeting God, getting through the cloud of unknowing, clearing yourself out. But what about that? I like the T.S. Eliot, in your end is your beginning. It's that first moment of turning. And I think that one of the great things in everyday life is not to be upset that you haven't had a transcendent experience, is not to be upset that you sometimes don't focus on what you're doing, or that you sometimes get a bit cross, or you forget about compassion, or one of those things. It seems to me that the thing to do is to just have that moment, that first moment of consciousness, and it's always new, where you think, this is going on, and oh yes, it's going on. Like, I'm eating a meal, just eat the meal, where's the salt? Oh, I'm eating the meal, I'm thinking of the salt. That little turning away from the absolutely everyday is possibly, the most important thing of all. And maybe we won't ever get any further than that. I'm sure I'm rather inclined not to get much further. The problem with all this is that we're told to go within, and we know somehow that ultimately that will connect us to the great one above and the absolute. But Jean-Paul Sartre, no fool, although when he turned to communism and wrote a 600-page book called I can't even remember its title, about how communism is the ultimate, abandoning his existentialism. I did wonder about him, and he's rather a curious character. But Sartre, his first and best philosophy book it's only 500 pages. It's called L'être et le néant, which is being and nothingness. I'm sure you all know about it. You probably also know that l'être is the 10,000 things. It's the world, it's everyday life. And the néant is subjectivity, is consciousness. He says that our consciousness is like a camera with its lens. Let's say, we know there's a film behind it and all that kind of thing, but ultimately, consciousness is like the empty hole that the camera, when you point your camera at something in the old-fashioned cameras, the lens looked, as it were, empty. There's nothing in the lens, and it looks at the object. And the idea that our consciousness is like that and can be described by an atheist existentialist as le néant, the nothing with a capital N, rather gets us back to Buddhism. What we're looking at is nirvana, which is the candle flame that has been there and is now blown out. So we might think in our own lives that as we turn away from the individual things that we're doing, the turning away, which I'm sort of recommending as a kind of minimal mysticism or Buddhism for babies, the turning away is a recognition that what we're offering towards it is not your glorious self, your wonderful soul, your majestic being. All those exist at the level of the 10,000 things, but the emptiness that is at the center of consciousness, the thing which makes you able to say, cogito ergo sum, I am conscious, therefore I am, and the am is the rest of the world. I think one of the difficulties in this is the verb have. We're rather inclined to think that we have a life. I'm not at all sure that we have a life. I don't quite know where it would be. You can write a history of a life very well, but when it comes down to it, you don't collect up the moments and the hours. You try to with photographs and memories and that kind of thing, and that's rather touching and rather nice, and I'm not at all against it. But you know that the photograph of the event is not the event. You no longer have the event, and when you visit it the second time, you can't step into the same river twice. It's not entirely clear to me that we have a life. The atheist philosopher, of course, the Buddhists would say, of course not. It's just a conception. We don't stop at the edge of humanity and then move out into something else, which isn't. We are entirely all imbricated in each other in one huge part. And I don't think we have a soul. I think it's clear that's a confusion. People who weren't distinguishing between minds and consciousnesses and feelings and so on, and somewhere deep in that, there's the sort of, the real me I don't think, this is quite tough, I'm going back to the mystics again, I don't think we have a self. You have what's known as the empirical self. Your bank account is your bank account. It belongs to you, yourself, and not to me. This jacket is part of myself in a sense. And I suppose what I'm saying now is my voice, not your voice. You can easily say that's Lance himself. It's a perfectly reasonable grammatical thing to do. But it's not clear to me if you inspect yourself very closely and very deeply within. This is not pessimistic, but that there's anything sort of quintessential, essential there at all. It's something which is pointing from the subjective position out to the objective position. I mean, it's very strange that I can talk about myself. Who's doing the talking if I'm talking about myself? Well, it must be another self inside which is talking about myself. And it's that self inside which seems to have less substantiality or essentiality than the self outside. Once you can make that slight detachment, that's the other great Buddhist phrase, isn't it? Literally detach from the washing up and think I'm doing the washing up. Or better, when the chap carves you up on the road and you start getting angry, step back just for a moment and recognize who you are objectively. And then remember back here who you are subjectively. We are programmed. We are programmed by our DNA. We are programmed by our genes, obviously same thing really. We are programmed by our culture, by our upbringing, by our education, by our gender, and all sorts of things. We are programmed to have feelings and thoughts of all kinds. But we have the extraordinary privilege that we can look at them. And so when someone carves you up in a situation where you're not in a hurry, and there's no danger, and it really doesn't matter, and you become ragingly angry, that's an old gene, an old system in your brain, in your DNA, which is the aggression system, which enables you to fight off the saber-toothed tigers and go out and slay the mammoths and all that kind of thing, which we did for so many millions of years. That's how you're programmed. You're also programmed for compassion and the appreciation of beauty and all that sort of thing. But when you are being compassionate or angry or appreciating the beautiful, we can do that one thing. We can say, look, that's what I'm doing. I've got something which enables me to enjoy that beauty. Or I've got something which makes me angry now. That's all that Buddhist detachment means. And you're always beginning again. You're never going to get to a point. I mean, the Dalai Lama is as near as we can get to the Buddha these days. And, there's a wonderful story in Victor Chan's book about the Dalai Lama. He knew him rather well, lots of wonderful stories. But one of them was he accompanied him on a mission to India or somewhere where he was preaching. And the Dalai Lama gets ill. It's a true story. He gets ill. And so Victor Chan, gets the medic who's attending the place and they whisk him off to the hospital. As they go into the hospital, they're shouting, Dalai Lama, emergency, it's getting very ill. and some Indian doctor rushes out with an enormous hypodermic. And the Dalai Lama, the Dalai Lama sees this and Victor Chan's watching him and he goes, he doesn't like the look. You can be as zen as you like. You can be right out there, but you're always beginning again. There was His Holiness himself, right back at the very beginning, saying, mustn't react, mustn't be frightened. It's all an illusion, You're never going to get beyond. But the beyond you're not getting beyond. Sorry, you're never going to get beyond. But that's all right, because your everyday life is the thing in which you're either, looking at the stars or you're lying in the gutter, but there are just two possibilities there, the fully attached or the detached. It may never be more than that, and that may be enough. Thank you very much. Well, I don't imagine during that rant anybody managed to put anything in the chat. No, they didn't. Well, however, if anybody wants to say anything, or you may feel that silence is best, of course, but I think that Scott will organize who would like to speak and how. So please put up your hand or press the right button or whatever it is. I'm very sorry. Do you all feel you've just been in church?
Oh, Michael. Hi, Michael. If you could unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Lance, when we could go to the Queen's Hall, I went to a performance of the Mozart's Mass in C minor,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the leading soloists, a female, I was about 2 feet from her. And when I went home after the performance, I was on such a high, it took me about 3 days to come down.
Mm.
Such was the beauty and aesthetic of her voice. And contrasting that, Swami Muktananda said in his autobiography that God is sound. So there you get the European Mozart having that effect on me. And then you get Swami Muktananda saying God is sound.
Mm.
And I just
I
thought
like
if you
that
had
very
any...
much. Yes. I mean, it's all metaphor. One of the reasons that all thought is illusory is that it's all, I mean, Nietzsche, God knows, not a great mystic, but Nietzsche says, everything is metaphor, and God is sound. The word God is presumably a metaphor deeply buried in Indo-European languages, but sound is obviously a metaphor. I mean, sound is what God was like for you that evening with Mozart. And what else are you going to do? You can only experience it and later begin again, presumably, unless you're still on that high.
I'm just thinking, because music is the abstract of the arts, that it's not in physical form, so to speak. Mm. But my last point is when you look out into nature, you see the way flowers are formed on their leaves in the so-called divergent angle of 137. Mm. So knowing that, you can come to the understanding that there is a world behind the physical form, which is mystical, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, presumably there is the same spirit everywhere. There are the same spirits everywhere. There's the same energy everywhere and so on. Presumably in the most revolting and horrible places, as well as in the most beautiful. The only difference is that humans are so constructed that they can do the maths about the flower's angle, they can recognize the beauty of the flower's angle. So we have this enormous privilege of stepping back and seeing it at another level, which is absolutely marvelous. But the flower is essentially not separate from the air. The only thing that's different in the whole universe is our consciousness of the universe. Everything else is an amalgam. And some parts of it we're programmed to get spiritual feelings out of, and some we're not. That's just
my last comment is I've been listening to the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah.
And what amazed me was the way that they survived was to enter into deep states of mysticism inside the camps, even though all this horror was going on outside them, which I found amazing that that's how they survived, was going into those states,
You can imagine it. There's nothing much else to do out in Siberia, is there? Ghastly business, all that, wasn't it? But the Russians are this sounds an extraordinary thing for me to say, perhaps, but the Russians are very spiritual people. And, there's lots of madness, there's lots of alcoholism, lots of weirdness among Russians, and fantastic intelligence and so on, and great chess players. But they also have a sort of bent towards the spiritual. And maybe some of us have slightly different genes, which gives us that, just as the Romantics or Wordsworth or someone could see a daffodil and do as you do with the daffodil, and others, people have a tin ear and can't appreciate Mozart. I mean, just different cultures, different peoples, different genes. But that doesn't say anything about the fact that that's all objective, and the subjectivity is only us, or whatever else is fully conscious. I don't mind there being consciousness of other planets, and maybe bonobos have got it too, but except for consciousness, everything else is that strange illusion.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, do we have another question from a hand?
Yes, from Jeff.
Jeff.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was really interesting, that your talk, Lance. And I just wanted to make a comment about one of my friends. My friend is a serious meditator, and he's inspired me. I also try to meditate. And I don't try not to argue with him about this, but then again, I might end up arguing with him because he says to me that his goal is to become enlightened. And my feeling is that, certainly I think it would have reflected some of the things that you said, Lance, is that enlightenment is not something we can actually reach, you know. So I don't really feel as though if I'm meditating, I'm trying to be enlightened, you know. But I think that it might help me to be on a path, perhaps, you know, going in a kind of direction sometimes. And that's all. I have no real expectations. I'm always going to be human as well, you know. So I have a sort of different feeling about it to my friend. I just wanted to comment. I'd say that. Thank you.
Well, that's an absolutely wonderful comment, and thank you very much. Because I'm afraid to say, you know, obviously I'm going to say this because you're here and he isn't, but I think you're right, and he has just a bit too much grip on some goal. I mean, you know, I mean, I should be advising you to go on your path, and if you meet your friend, kill him. You know, I mean, that's perhaps a bit extreme, but you see where I'm going. I mean, it's wonderful that he's on the same path as you, and it's wonderful that he has this idea. But I mean, I think, how can I put this? Who am I? But I think it seems as he won't reach it. He won't reach it all day, every day. I mean, who knows what will happen at the end of 100 reincarnations? Perhaps he'll be in nirvana sneering at me back down on the stony path. But I think you think that he's unlikely to reach it. I suppose it's reasonable to have an aspiration and all that, but I think it's more Buddhist and more Zen and more peaceful and more likely to make you happy and reduce your suffering if you recognize your limitations and recognize that you are only on the path. And that whole metaphor of path and journey, the pilgrimage of life and all that, that has a great deal of juice in it, I think. You know, we're all going, we're not arriving.
Yes, yeah, right. No, thank you. Right.
Wonderful question. I like that a lot, or comment.
Thank you.
Scott, have we got anybody else, or am I going to go to the chat?
We've got Charlie.
Oh, let's have Charlie.
Oh, could you unmute yourself?
Following on from the last comment, how do you define enlightenment? And your talk was marvelous. It embraced so much that there's an awful lot to chew over. But how would you define enlightenment? Is it achieving that state of non-thinking, of all the opposites come in, and then how do you get there? How do you define it, and how do you get there? Now there are obviously various paths that other people have tried, or other disciplines, religions have tried. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in Buddhism, there's the slightly metaphorical notion of reincarnation, and at the end of thousands of reincarnations, you can come back as a Buddha, but mostly it'll just be a bodhisattva. Actually, mostly it won't be anything at all. And I think that's a metaphor for the fact you're never going to get there. The definition of enlightenment would, of course, be impossible. Nothing could be more conceptual than a definition, and you're asking me for a definition. And in answer to Michael, I pointed out that the arrival, which it would be, you know, sort of, it's like in Waiting for Godot, where one of the tramps says, "We're happy," and the other says, "Yes, we're happy." And the first one says, "Well, what do we do now that we're happy?" You know, "Oh, we're enlightened." Okay, "Oh, but I can feel an itch." We're enlightened. But I need my lunch. I mean, what, you know, I'm too enlightened to, you know, I mean, it's much better to say, I mean, why is it better? It's Confucius, you know, why is it better to travel hopefully than to arrive? That's mad. It's completely mad. We're trying to arrive, but it is better to travel hopefully. And I think, I mean, you know, the man who says, you know, I've got it. I mean, the Diamond Sutra, I mean, it's absolutely fabulous and it drives you completely nuts. In answer to an almost identical question from Subhuti, who's the sort of fall guy who asks the question so Buddha can give his wonderful answers. One of his, it's like, you know, if the bodhisattva has done this and has done this, wonderfully holy person has done this, become enlightened effectively, you know, what do we say to him? And you say to him, he is not the bodhisattva, because he's claimed to be the bodhisattva. That's the bit I mentioned earlier. But he's also not the bodhisattva, because if you insist that something is not, you're setting up a concept of something else which is. And there are no concepts, they're all wrong, they're all an illusion, so there's neither the thing nor not the thing. At which point you go and have another gin. I mean, you know, you cannot follow it. So, I mean, you're asking the question, but to which there absolutely is no answer. Just keep trying, man. And we do, don't we?
On questions that perhaps can't be answered, Graham Kidd has said, I expect many worry about the purpose of life. Is there any? Or just experience until you learn to not experience?
Oh, I love that last bit. Experience until you learn not to experience. That's a good sort of Zen answer, isn't it? I absolutely love it. I think, can I go back to the verb have? I don't think you can do anything by collecting. You don't collect up hours and days. You don't collect up bits of a life. You don't collect really anything. And I remember an Indian friend coming to visit me, and I'd done him several favors, as it happened. I was just able to. And he was a lovely man, and he clearly, how can I say this, but he clearly valued my advice, and he was sort of, you know, he'd come to visit the chap he wanted to talk to about literary matters and other things. He was a lovely chap. And I remember I took him to a bus to say goodbye to him. He'd taken the bus back down to London. And I thought, well, I'm not quite sure what they do in India, you know, but I guess we're going to fall into each other's arms, and he's going to give me that look which says, Lance, you know, I really value you and thank you so much for everything. And it's been wonderful. All the things that we say. And I turned to him. He looked at me and he got into the bus. That was it. Nothing else. I thought, bloody hell. I made all this effort for this guy, and I brought him to the bus station, and I gave him dinner last night in a bed. And oh my God, and I got him to speak at that conference, and he just buggers off. He was right. I was wrong. He had separated. He had not tried to collect Lance as a friend and somebody else as a friend. Here are my friends. Oh yes, we've got friends. I love all my friends. Some of them are on these screens. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. One of them drops dead. I moved to Timbuktu. I don't see them again, and there's no postal service. At some level, that has not to matter. We're going to lose all our friends in the end, until possibly we join them on the other side, but it'll all be entirely different. And can I say one other thing about all this stuff about, what is it, purpose of life or intention or aim or becoming or travel? Of course, it's all rubbish because there's no time. Yes, Peter.
Thank you, Lance. Your talk was so good, it contradicted itself because I kept on having thoughts about other things all along the way, which is clearly what you're not supposed to do.
Yeah, why am I talking?
The first thought I had was that when you were talking about existentialism and Sartre and so on, I mean, engagement is the opposite pole of serene nothingness, I think, in both Buddhist and in perhaps Sartrean terms. It was always the key existential dilemma, but Sartre kind of talked a good game, but Camus kind of lived it, you know.
Yeah, I feel that.
And when the Nazis are at the door, I just wonder how much you're engaged with nothingness, you know, and how much you're prepared to do what Camus did, which was to risk his life. And Sartre was a bit of a collaborator, actually.
Yes, I know. Oh, those old chestnuts. I mean, my generation was tortured. We're all sort of young existentialists, I suppose, in the 50s and 60s. We were tortured by these questions. You too, dear boy, I'm sure. All I can say is, on the one hand, we have the story of the Buddha in one of his incarnations meditating in a temple, and the robbers come in with their swords and they chop him up. And as they're chopping him up, he says, it's all Maya. It's all an illusion. Nobody's doing anything. I am one with the sword. I am one with the... You know. Now, that's what you might call a target story. I don't believe it happened. I mean, if I get out my chainsaw and you are tied down naked and I approach you with my chainsaw and say, I'm now going to cut off your legs without any anesthetic. I do not... The Dalai Lama didn't want an injection. You know, I don't think you're going to just say it's an illusion. I mean, there just has to be a limit to that. So you know, anyway, as far as engagement is concerned, I'm afraid, the great existentialist idea was more life. Camus' idea was you get more life, like St. Paul's, life more abundant. The more you're engaged, the more life you have. And you know, if you just sit there saying, well, I don't know, no, I won't go out, thank you very much, I'll just stay here, I don't care. Oh, someone's suffering, I don't care. If you do that, obviously, you're going to have less life, whatever that's defined. But I don't think you have a life in that sense. You know, and I feel that there's something slightly naive about the idea of, you know, it's rather American, isn't it? You've got to be really committed, you know.
But you're a professor of literature, and you have to recognize that much great art was produced out of neurotic anti-nothingness, you know, different kinds of engagement.
Van Gogh.
We wouldn't have all
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
And as a fellow existentialist, although my wife came back at the weekend, so I had to sort of stop being one. I always found when I discovered Waiting for Godot, I found the nothingness that is the void that is at the center of that he presents so magnificently. I found it incredibly comforting.
Yeah.
That's good. That's where it kind of it all comes full circle.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But is there somebody else who'd like to say something?
Yes. So we've got a couple of hands that I see, but we've also just got one more question in the chat from Eve, who said that you mentioned incarnation. And could you tell us your opinion about reincarnation?
Well, you won't be surprised to know that I absolutely can, and it's quite brief. I think reincarnation is real. I think that people who tell these extraordinary stories about past lives, some of which are absolutely convincing, are speaking the truth, and they have got memories. I notice it fades as they get older, and I do notice also that they are not the previous person. They are Jane, who's an American, shoe sales lady, and originally they were, some Egyptian princess or a bloke in the 18th century France or something like that. They are not the same person. They don't have the same names. They don't have all the same characteristics. They share some memories. So it looks as if out there on the other side, in the spirit world, which in our mediumship demonstrations and elsewhere, and in the spiritualist church we have, and like all other spiritualist churches, people are apparently in touch with the dead in various ways. And yet you wonder, they're in touch with someone who died 40 years ago. What's all that about? I think what it is that it's a timeless zone beyond, and consequently anything can happen at any time. Brian Weiss has had some successes in past life therapy, going to the future and showing people or getting people to get them memories of a future life. So everything's mixed up, everything's messed up, as it were, and perhaps it's not a mess though, so that you may find that 60% of all reincarnation cases are people who've died a violent death. So people who really feel they've been cut off in their prime or cut off before they could do their things and haven't managed to come back from a near-death experience, say, they're there, they're dead, they've got some unfinished business, and that the energy of that unfinished business on the other side is channeled through some child who will remember it for the first 6 years of his life or whatever. So I think reincarnation happens, but it's not, Joe becomes Fred, full stop. That's a very sort of Christian notion. You have one life and then you're judged and there's this, and, oh, someone's come back from the other side. Bits of someone, forces from someone. So, for example, if you think of an NDE where you meet your deceased relatives, you might say, wait a minute, this deceased relative, dead for many, many years, how did he get here? Well, we can only assume that the consciousness that is the deceased relative is able, in this timeless zone, at will, to project himself where he's needed or where he's called by some other energy. And so similarly with reincarnation, there's a moment where the dead person, consciousness projects itself into a new body and goes through a new experience. So it happens, but not I've heard people say, reincarnation can't be true because there are now so many more of us. Where did they all come from if reincarnation is true? That's the sort of naive view of reincarnation, which just can't be right. But clearly, some things are transferred in that way.
Thank you. We've got Richard and Michael. Just ask Richard, just in the spirit of giving everyone a chance.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Lance?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. And first of all, thank you so much. I wanted to say a couple of things. You've inspired me, first of all, to the memory of, I have actually seen you with a chainsaw in your hand, and it is indeed an alarming thing to see. While you were talking about chainsaws, it reminded me about, I'm going to misquote a couple of people. First of all, Albert Einstein, who I think said that reality is an illusion, but the trouble is it's an extremely convincing one. And I'm now going to misquote completely somebody else. Somebody told me one of these wonderful Zen stories about some sort of traveling poet monk who was invited by, you probably know the story, invited by some great monarch to write a poem. And the poem he wrote was, grandfather dies, father dies, son dies. And the great emperor said, well, what's this supposed to be about? What sort of a celebratory ode is that? And he said, well, how else would you like it to be?
Yes, very good. A little stoic resignation in there, a little reality. Yes, I like that very much indeed. And I'm sorry if I frightened you with my chainsaw. I can easily remember it, actually. Yes, how else would you like it to be? Yeah, we one of the very good, there's a chap called Paul Gilbert who's written a book called The Compassionate Mind, which is psychotherapy meets Buddhism. And he doesn't shove the Buddhism down your throat. He's a proper psychotherapist, and it's quite good. And he says, look, we all just find ourselves here. Peter and other existentialists will remind me that Heidegger refers to that as Geworfenheit ins Dasein, thrownness into being. We're just thrown into being. You don't think, I think I'm going to have, well, maybe you do on the other side, but we don't feel it here. You know, I think I'll have this kind of life, have that kind of life. I'm going to be this kind of person. You find yourself here. I mean, you're surrounded by what Beckett, you must forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, called the shit. You were surrounded by that from the beginning. And it's not as if we have any choice. I'll just go back out again. You got to get on with what you've got around you. You know, how else would you like it to be? It's going to be like this. This is your DNA. These are your circumstances. Doesn't mean things can't change, but the thing to do is to do a certain amount of acceptance and stoicism instead of the very modern idea that everything can and must be changed all the time, which is over optimistic. And look what terrible disasters really good changes have brought about. I mean, all this medicine, what's it done? Produced 7.5 billion people. What have they done? They're about to destroy the planet and themselves. If there weren't 7.5 billion people, we wouldn't have global warming. We wouldn't all be headed for the tomb. We're all headed for the tomb because of the successes of medicine. So be careful what you think of changing. Just a thought. Was there another Michael?
Michael.
Another Michael.
Hello. To me, guys, just quickly, the idea of illusion is only relevant if you understand the holographic nature of the universe that we're in.
Okay. Tell me about that.
Well, at this level of the manifestation, it is real, but it's like a holographic projection. For example, that's why the human ear is shaped like a fetus. Within the cell represents the whole of the body and vice versa. So if you understand the nature of the so-called cerebral spinal fluid, that's where the holographic light starts to manifest itself on the physical form. And that's why the cerebral spinal fluid is the highest known element in the body. It contains the so-called light within the liquid light, the ambrosia. And it's so essential to get that. For example, people who don't circulate that through the brain start to suffer from dementia. So what I'm trying to say is that beyond the physical form, there's a light source which connects us to different parts of the reality. And
I think it's very important to remember that the Buddha believed there were gods. He just thought they were subject to the same constraints as we are. And I think it must be right that there are dimensions beyond our own dimension and beings of light and lights and energies and so on. And some of them may well interact with the spinal fluid and whatever it is in the same way as consciousness is something which uses the brain to operate through. I mean, there is an interaction between the physical and the non-physical. I'm sure that's right. And to a degree, once you start making these distinctions, you're right. You've got reality. Once you've got a conception, this is real, this is not real, or this is like this, or this parallels with that, or these two things, bounce off each other, whatever it is. Those are all the conceptions whereby we divide up the 10,000 things. And the difficulty is you have to keep stepping back because you have to realize that they're not really separate, which is rather what you've just said. There's something up there in my spine which isn't separate from the light of the universe. I mean, and you think that is connected to my spine, which is connected to the rest of me.
Lance, if you think of the reality as being fractal in nature.
Holographic or fractal,
You get the 5 platonic solids, and now they're understanding that the universe of physical form is fractal in nature through the understanding of the golden ratio, etc.
And you get this in Rupert Sheldrake's morphic fields, where the small bits echo fractally echo the big bits. The morphogenetic field, he sometimes calls it. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, my dear.
We had a hand there from Robert.
Thank you.
Hi, Robert.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hello, Lance. First of all, enjoyed it as always. But I must say I have a bit of a headache now.
You might go a bit fast, Robert. Is that the problem?
No, well, sometimes you do, but maybe I'm a bit slow. So we'll take 50-50 on that. But going back to reincarnation, I think it makes so much sense that reincarnation is real. It does exist. Looking back on my own life, I realize I've made so many mistakes, so many things I would like to put right, but I'm running out of time. I'm nearly halfway through my 80s. So if I live another 20 years, I probably won't make up for the mistakes I've made. So I would desperately like another chance to come back and make up for many of those mistakes. So to me,
yes.
So yeah.
Well, you know that the near-death experience people are very clear that very often they're told they must come back, or there's a choice that they should come back. And the standard Eastern and sort of modern spiritualist line is that there are some possibilities of choosing to come back in particular ways and for particular reasons. I mean, there was one guy who was a medium who was doing, reincarnated and near-deathy people and working on it all. And his line was that he thought that he'd come back in order to learn how to speak in public. Now, I mean, that seems a bit sort of small as a reason, but he said he'd been tortured, but now he wasn't so tortured, or he had some memories or whatever. So it can be maybe quite small things. So I'm sure your errors, Robert, are not enormous. Nonetheless, you may be given an opportunity to rectify them, I suppose.
That's very consoling. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I can see Hugh's hand there, but I've got a question from Nick Kyle. Would you like to ask it yourself, Nick?
Yeah, perhaps we create reality through consciousness. And I don't mean our perceptions of it. I mean reality in the sense of it seems to be different and independent from our intentions. And I'm thinking really of beings who are from other dimensions of existence who occasionally interfere or intrude or manifest in magical ways that are currently inexplicable. And if I could just finish by posing a question that I was asked by my university tutor. Sometimes if you don't find the answers you seek, it's because you lack imagination.
Yes. So the imagination would create the answers you seek. Well, I think there's an enormous amount of juice in modern thinking, and not only woo-woo thinkers like us, whereby we feel that consciousness creates the world, that imagination creates reality, that our ideas and our languages create what's about us. And it's right there in the Dhamma Sutra, right there at the beginning of Buddhism, that we make up the worlds because we divide one thing from another, thus creating conceptions. We conceive the divisions, and there you are with it. And I think once you get a different perspective, let's say the perspective from the other side by an ascended being, or the perspective, God knows, from a man from Mars, you might easily find that things look very different. And they look different because of the thinking of the ascended being or the man from Mars, not because things themselves actually change much, since they are all a kind of amalgam. What about, was there a Hugh?
There is a Hugh.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, Lance, how also, may I say, how much I enjoyed your talk. And like Richard, I've also seen you waving a power saw around in a terrifying way. That was a particular piece of reality I wasn't prepared to face myself, because I find them so frightening. But if I may go back to the subject of your talk, I think it was spirituality, mysticism, and everyday life. And I think, as you know, Lance, I'm very much on the lower slopes, or the nursery slopes of all of this kind of stuff, and very much in the everyday life bit of all of this. So I wondered, for those of us who, I quite like the idea of being on a journey to somewhere, but then I know it's, I'm not very interested in finding God at the end of it, actually. Certainly, that sort of single figure. But then I'm told I can't get it anyway. I've got to go on this journey, but here's the thing. I recently had a problem with my knee, Lance, and I went to a very good course of consultations with a sort of physiotherapist chap who gave me exercises to do, and the exercises seemed to help. So here you are, you're a professor. I wonder if you've got any advice for exercises, which those of us who are rather unmystical and feel rather unspiritual at the moment might become a little more spiritual and a little more mystic.
Well, I think that is the question that I was attempting to answer by that notion of turning away or stepping back just an instant. When you you can just sit there thinking, oh God, my knee hurts, and then, you know, getting the relationship with the doctor. But I'm sure, I think it happens quite easily. I'm sure there's a moment, I don't know, he goes out of the room and you sit there and you think, good heavens, forgive me, Hugh, but you might think, I'm rather old. My knees don't work so much. And do you know, I'm here and I'm making all this happen with my consciousness. That little step was what I was talking about.
On a sort of regular basis, Lon, how would I mean, you know, I've got to sit in my armchair and think about it.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what, I mean, what rescues this evening's Zoom and all of this stuff is that we are poor, weak mortals and we need help. And I'll put it this way, you'll see the point. You and I have met, most of us here have met, let's say, two sorts of people. Those who are open to some of the things that we've been talking about this evening and those who are not. The difference between these two groups is that those who have absolutely no belief in it at all, no interest in it, thinks it's all nonsense, have never approached it, studied it, looked at it, read about it, watched it on telly, seen a YouTube, gone to a church, gone to a guru, tried to meditate. They've never done any of that stuff because it's all crap. Everyone who's a bit interested in it, who has something to say, who feels there might be something there, has made some step. Someone has said something to them. They've read a book. They've seen something on YouTube. They've attended a talk, whatever. And that's very, very interesting because, you know, if you want, do you want your surgeon, your expert on your knee, not to have read any surgery? Well, obviously not. You want him to be the guy who's gone there and looked at the YouTubes and been to the classes and become a doctor and become a surgeon. I mean, there are such things as experts. I'm not one, but there are experts in this field. So the answer to your question is, besides a little bit of detachment, is just to look at it. I guarantee that no one on this Zoom call, including you, could watch back to back 100 videos on YouTube of NDE survivors and their stories. Some of them take 40 minutes, some of them only take 10, so you'd be there for a long time. I guarantee if you watch 100 of those, you will no longer think, there's no such thing as life after death. There's no meaning in the universe. We're not going anywhere. It's all rubbish. I'm just going to fall into a pit and die. And that's the end of it. And why am I bothering? You will think,
Well, you might well be right. And I have noted that, Lance, and thank you very much. But I can't help noticing that also in the chat, your dear wife, disguising herself under the name Pauline Morgan, has written Mindfulness Meditation. Now, come on, as the professor, you have the stage here, but I mean, is mindfulness enough? I mean, is that
well, it's the start, and how far do you get beyond the start? If you're happy with just mindfulness, great. If you're not happy, look at some stuff and read some stuff. Both things are true. Mindfulness meditation takes you a tremendous way. My idea of turning away is just mindfulness, and you can call it meditation and sit there and go through it if you can do it. I find it very difficult to meditate for a long time. Other people meditate for 8 hours a day. But if you can do 2 minutes or 2 seconds of detachment, it's better than none. And I don't think there are any rules here. I mean, you don't have to be anything. You don't have to get better. You have to do what you want. And I take it that you're here either because you're supporting me or because there is some tiny thing that you want.
Both of those.
But if there's nothing that you want, then you're already there.
Both of those. Thank you very much. I feel I should hand back to somebody else. So
yes.
I think you've long enough.
Well, I mean, we must all stop fairly soon. I mean, isn't that enough for everybody?
We've got one more question, I think, from Graham Kidd. I'm not sure where you are. So I'll just ask it. Should we seek paranormal effects, if only to convince us of alternative reality and put us on the right path? And does spiritual practice make this more likely? Have you experienced anything paranormal yourself that was evidential?
Well, I mean, I think the way the world works is that many things come to us, 10,000 things come to us, and we are programmed to make selections, as I've just been saying. This includes paranormal effects. As they come towards us, first of all, we have to identify them as paranormal, and then we have to react to them. And I think that happens to a great number of people. I mean, one of my other bets is that you can't have 4 people in the room unless, I mean, if you have 4 people in the room, at least one of them will always have had some quite striking paranormal experience, at least one of them. And that's that's 25% of the population, if I'm right. And the idea of an alternative reality is, of course, terrific, because I mean, this reality is alternative to, you know, the pure consciousness of abstract being. You know, all the different things are somehow alternative in the sense that we are creating. They're alternative to ourselves. They're the objective alternative to the subjective self that we are imprisoned in, if you like, or that we always are. As for myself, yes, I've had a number of paranormal experiences, and I know people who've had, whom I totally trust and believe in, who've had very much stronger paranormal experiences. Funnily enough, I had a brief paranormal experience on Christmas Day. I had my first glass of champagne, which may have made a difference, but it was a sense of complete bliss and absolute peace and a complete oneness, which I felt before, so I was able to recognize it, which changes the color of the world and changes the color of everything and makes everything all right. Now, I've only had 6 of those in my life, but one was this last Christmas Day, and it just happened. And you just rise. I don't mean like in a near-death experience, like an out-of-body experience, but you rise, you kind of swell in a sense of bliss and freedom and love. That's only a very minor one. God, I mean, other people, I mean, Father Joseph Coppertino, when saying Mass, would levitate 10 feet in the air, and thousands of people saw it. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of really hairy things. And my predecessor as the chair of the Arthur Conan Doyle Center, Anne Traherne, if you read her book, Arthur and Me, which came out at the end of last year, it begins with her extraordinary visions of the Dunblane massacre, which she had 6 times in beautiful Technicolor before it happened. I mean, I just do think that there are I mean, if you start from the position that paranormal experiences, effects can't exist, or you can't have them because they don't exist, you're just wrong. They do, whatever they mean, they do exist. And I notice that nobody is now trying to deny that near-death experiences exist. People now try to say, oh, well, they're not quite what you say they are. But no one, but in the early days, they were, oh, poo-poo, it doesn't happen. Now people say, well, yes, it does happen, which is a good move forward. So we've got to say what it is. I think there's plenty of paranormal stuff around. It's very important. And it does teach you things. It blasts you out of your sneakers. Is that enough for enough?
You could end it there.
I think I've delighted you long enough, to quote Jane Austen. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming. And I would like Scott to close the meeting. And I'd love to see you in my poetry and spirituality course. And of course, when we reopen in our center, we will have our spiritualist church reopened. And of course, that is a place where you can assess for yourselves what's happening in the paranormal, as you might call it, or spiritual world. And we also have a theosophical library in our basement and all sorts of interesting things. But we're not open at the moment. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I think I'm going to go and have dinner now to prove how Buddhist I am.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.